There are moments in a political career that arrive not as setbacks, but as the inevitable consequence of a strategy whose internal contradictions were visible from the day it was announced. What is happening to Gavin Newsom this week, the defensive press appearances, the visibly rattled responses to questions he had to know were coming, the unraveling of a high-profile initiative that was supposed to anchor his case for higher office, none of it surprises me. Not one bit. Because when a governor spends his entire tenure positioning himself as the principled alternative to the political dysfunction of the other party, when he builds his public brand around the idea that California represents the responsible adult in the room, and then proceeds to author a redistricting maneuver that abandons every procedural principle his state had spent 2 decades celebrating. Eventually, the contradiction collapses in public. The voters notice. The press notices. The reformers in his own coalition, the ones who fought for years to establish the very system he has now agreed to override, notice loudest of all. And when the contradiction finally becomes the story, when the maneuver designed to advantage his party becomes the case study in unprincipled opportunism, his critics had been predicting all along, the carefully managed political brand of the man at the center of it comes apart faster than any communications team can repair. It doesn't matter how many supportive interviews get scheduled. It doesn't matter how many op-eds get placed. The original principle either meant something or it didn't. And what is unfolding in California this week tells you exactly which way that question has been resolved. Let's go back. Because to understand the panic visible in the governor's appearances this week, you have to understand where the contradiction at the heart of this maneuver first revealed itself. November 2010. California voters approve Proposition 20, expanding the authority of the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission that had been established 2 years earlier. The vote was decisive. The reform was widely celebrated as a model for the country. Democratic and Republican good government advocates alike pointed to California as evidence that a state could remove congressional and legislative map drawing from the hands of self-interested politicians and entrust it to an independent body with bipartisan and unaffiliated representation. The premise was simple. Districts drawn by the people who would compete in them were inherently corrupt. The solution was structural, and in that moment, if you were paying attention, if you understood anything at all about how reform victories survive over time, you understood exactly what California had built. You had built a model whose moral authority depended on its consistent application. You had built an institutional commitment whose value resided precisely in its insulation from short-term political pressure. You had built, in other words, the kind of reform that means something only if it holds when holding it is inconvenient. The governor who would later become the central figure in dismantling that principle was, at the time of its passage, the lieutenant governor-elect. He inherited the reform. He benefited from its association with the state's brand. He invoked it on multiple occasions across the years as evidence of California's superior approach to democratic governance. That was the foundation he is now eroding. That was the principle he has now agreed, on the record, to override when the partisan stakes seemed to require it. The contradiction was always going to come due. It is coming due this week. Now I want you to think about how this has been covered, or really, how the substantive coverage has been displaced by the strategic coverage. For most of the past year, when the major national outlets and the cable programs have addressed Newsom's redistricting maneuver, the framing has overwhelmingly been about the partisan stakes, the political horse race, the question of whether the move would succeed in producing the seat gains its architects projected. The substantive questions, what the maneuver actually meant for the principle of independent redistricting that California had pioneered, what message it sent to reformers in other states who had used the California example as their model, what it revealed about the durability of procedural commitments when partisan interests pulled the other way, have been ceded almost entirely to the editorial pages and to the small handful of journalists willing to focus on the institutional rather than the tactical dimensions. The major outlets covered it as a political move. The editorial pages covered it as a betrayal. Most viewers entering this week's developments had no framework for evaluating what was actually being undone. because the framework requires the kind of institutional attention that the political press has, over years, allowed to atrophy. The governor's defenders argued the move was necessary, that the other side had broken the rules first, that asymmetric restraint was no longer tenable. The governor's critics argued the move surrendered the moral high ground his state had spent 2 decades occupying. Both arguments contained elements of truth. Neither framework provided viewers with the context they needed to understand what was being permanently changed. Well, the country is going to be living with the consequences of this change for a long time, because the precedent established by California's abandonment of its own reform is now available to every governor in every state, regardless of party and regardless of what they decide they want to use it for. Let's talk about the promises, because the governor has invoked them throughout his career. The promise of principled governance, the promise of California as the model, the promise that his administration would represent the alternative to the procedural opportunism he had spent years criticizing in the other party. That last promise alone, repeated across speeches and op-eds and donor events for the better part of a decade, should have created a binding standard against which this year's maneuver could be evaluated. It wasn't an aspiration. It wasn't a campaign slogan. It was a deliberate, repeated, documented commitment that the principles his state embodied were not transactional, that California's approach represented something more than tactical preference, that the willingness to maintain procedural commitments when they cost you was the entire point of having procedural commitments in the first place. And the maneuver this year has shattered that commitment in front of every reformer in every state who had used California as their reference point. Beyond the broken promise on principle, what's left of the governor's positioning? A series of justifications that have shifted as the political circumstances have evolved, each justification requiring its own rationalization, each rationalization contradicting the prior one. A pattern of media appearances in which he has been visibly less comfortable defending the substantive question than his standard performances would suggest. A communication strategy that has emphasized the asymmetric nature of the broader political environment, while declining to engage with the specific institutional cost of the specific decision he made. A governor who, when asked direct questions about why the principle California voters approved in 2010 was no longer operative in 2026, has chosen on multiple occasions to redirect the question to the conduct of other states, rather than to defend his own conduct on its merits. That is not the posture of a politician confident in his decision. That is the conduct of a man who knows what the principle was, knows what the principle meant, and is exhausting every available rhetorical mechanism to avoid the direct contradiction his maneuver has produced. And then there is the human cost, which is the part of this story the political coverage rarely centers. The collateral damage that the strategic framing obscures. Behind every redistricting decision, behind every map line redrawn, behind every press conference celebrating reform or condemning rollback, there are voters whose relationship to their own representation depends on the procedural commitments their states have made. The Californians who voted twice in 2008 and 2010 for the Independent Commission. The reformers in other states who used the California example to win their own ballot measures. The voters in those other states whose own independent commissions are now facing political pressure to follow California's lead on the entirely sensible logic that if California can override its commission when partisan interests require it, no state's commission is safe from similar override under similar pressure. The cumulative effect is a country in which the most prominent model of independent redistricting has been substantially undermined by the very state that established it, and in which the broader project of removing partisan self-interest from map drawing has been set back by years, if not decades. Voters are rendering their verdict in the polling, in the visible decline in trust in California's reform institutions, in the conversations happening in good government organizations across the country about whether the California model can survive what California itself has done to it. The reformers who spent careers building those institutions are speaking, in opinion pieces and in interviews, about the betrayal of the project they understood themselves to be advancing. The former commissioners themselves, including members who served on the very body the governor's maneuver overrode, have appeared in public to describe their experience and their dismay. That is the cost. And the cost is being paid not by the governor, who continues to hold his office and to be discussed as a potential future candidate for higher office, but by the broader cause of independent redistricting, whose most prominent example has now been substantially compromised by the actions of its own state's chief executive. Now let's talk about what specifically happened this week, because the precision of the backfire is what makes it consequential. The legal challenges to the redistricting maneuver, brought by a coalition of reform organizations and individual plaintiffs, reached a stage in which a state court issued a ruling that, by multiple accounts of attorneys involved, substantially undermined the legal premises on which the governor's office had been operating. The ruling, while not yet final and subject to appeal, included findings that the procedural pathway used to bypass the independent commission was constitutionally questionable on grounds the governor's legal team had assured him would not be raised successfully. The ruling produced an immediate political reaction. The press corps that had previously been content to cover the maneuver as a tactical question began asking the substantive questions that should have been asked from the beginning. The governor's appearances in the days following the ruling have been, by the consensus of observers across the political spectrum, visibly more strained than his standard performances. Now, I want to be precise here, because precision matters in a matter this serious. The governor's defenders have argued, correctly, that the ruling is not final, that the legal questions involved are genuinely complex, and that the broader political context, including conduct by political actors in other states, provides relevant context for evaluating the maneuver. Fine. That is a legitimate point as far as it goes. But here is what it does not change. A maneuver that was sold to the public as a necessary response to extraordinary circumstances has now run into legal complications that the governor's own attorneys reportedly did not predict at the scale they have materialized. The cumulative effect on the governor's positioning, on his state's reform brand, on the broader project of independent redistricting, is now substantial and ongoing. And the governor's reaction this week, the visible strain across appearances his team had previously controlled with ease, suggests that he understands the consequences of the situation more clearly than his most supportive surrogates do. And the pattern matters because what surfaced this week is not an isolated political setback. It runs through the entire arc of the governor's tenure like a thread. You saw it in the recall election, in which the governor survived but which exposed the depth of voter discontent across regions and constituencies his coalition had previously taken for granted. You saw it in the homelessness initiatives in which billions of dollars in expenditure produced, by his own administration's auditing, a less than commensurate reduction in the underlying problem. You saw it in the public safety debates, in which the governor's positioning shifted multiple times as the political environment moved, leaving him visibly out of step with the constituencies he was simultaneously trying to satisfy. You saw it in the high-speed rail project, the generational commitment whose cost has multiplied and whose timeline has stretched, and whose completed segments now stand as the kind of partial infrastructure that critics have spent years pointing to as evidence of the gap between the state's ambitions and its execution. No single one of these matters was supposed to be the term-defining one. The strategy was always to treat each in isolation, to absorb the individual hits, to count on the governor's communication skills and the state's strong economic base to prevent the cumulative case from cohering. The cumulative case has now cohered. The redistricting backfire has placed the central question, whether this governor governs by principle or by tactical convenience, in front of voters in a register that the prior controversies had not produced. Here is the thing about the governor's positioning that I think his most committed defenders have never been willing to examine honestly. The contradiction at the heart of his political brand is not incidental. It is not the product of any single difficult decision or any uniquely challenging political environment. It is structural. It is baked into the impossibility of simultaneously claiming the mantle of principled governance and engaging in the kind of tactical maneuvering that has characterized his major decisions across the relevant years. He has always been a politician of considerable rhetorical gifts, capable of describing the kind of state he wished to lead in language his supporters found compelling. He has consistently been a politician whose actual decisions, when they conflicted with the rhetorical framework, have favored the tactical over the principled. The framework survived as long as the conflict was not visible. The redistricting maneuver has made the conflict unavoidable. And there is no better physical monument to that contradiction than the state capitol building itself, the dome on the Sacramento horizon under which the governor convened the legislative special sessions that produced the maneuver. The same building, the same chambers, the same offices where the original 2008 reforms were celebrated as evidence of the state's procedural maturity have now hosted the proceedings that compromised those reforms. The building stands. The continuity of its architecture against the substantive transformation of the work conducted within it provides a kind of visual record that the political coverage has been slow to register. If you wanted a metaphor for what has happened to the governor's positioning, you could not do better than the contrast between the public ceremonies that have been held under that dome celebrating California's reform tradition and the closed-door sessions held in the same building this year that undermined the most prominent of those reforms. Now I want to pause here and address something directly. In the days since the ruling, a particularly ugly current of online commentary has emerged targeting the governor's family in personal terms, including content aimed at his spouse and at his children in ways that have nothing whatsoever to do with the substance of the redistricting question. It is wrong. Full stop. I can believe that the governor has serious questions to answer about the principles he abandoned and the legal exposure he created. I can document the institutional failures of the maneuver, and I can still say without hesitation that his spouse, who holds no role in any of these decisions, and his children, who are minors and chose nothing about their public exposure, should be entirely off limits in this discussion. Those two things are not in conflict. They are, in fact, required to coexist if anyone wants to retain the moral authority to demand accountability from the governor himself. The people circulating the personal material are not advancing the cause of principled governance. They are giving the governor's defenders the easiest possible distraction from the substantive question. Decency applies to the families of politicians we agree with. It applies to the families of politicians we disagree with. It applies always. I want to address something else directly, because I know how these conversations get framed. Asking honest questions about what California did this year is not partisan in the simple sense, and it is not anti-California. It is not the work of bitter critics looking for any opportunity to attack a state whose economic and cultural contributions to the country are substantial across every measure. It is the most basic form of accountability for a reform tradition that the state itself promoted as a national model. The evidence is now substantial. The 2008 and 2010 ballot measures and the principle they established. The years of public celebration of the independent commission. The decisions of this year that overrode the commission's authority. The legal challenges those decisions produced. The court ruling this week that has now substantially complicated the maneuver. The visible strain in the governor's appearances as he has attempted to defend the decision. The reactions from former commissioners, from reform organizations, from voters whose own states' reform efforts depended on the California example. All of it points in the same direction. The irony of history, and history is full of ironies, is that the governor's own choices, the decisions he made when the principle he had inherited became inconvenient, have done more to expose the gap between his stated values and his governing conduct than any external campaign could have achieved. The promise of principled California governance collapsed into a maneuver whose only justification was tactical. The promise of the state as a national model collapsed into a precedent that other states will now cite when they wish to override their own reforms. The promise of independent redistricting collapsed, in the most prominent example of its kind, at the hands of the governor whose state had pioneered it. He was given every conceivable advantage, a reform tradition with broad public support, a political coalition prepared to defend most of his decisions, a media environment generally inclined to favorable coverage of his administration. a national profile that positioned him for higher office on the strength of the very brand he has now compromised. He squandered the advantages repeatedly by choosing the tactical option when the principled option was available and visible, and would have served his long-term positioning more effectively than the short-term maneuver he selected. Not because the political environment was uniquely hostile — governors face hostile environments — not because the choices were genuinely impossible — the choices were difficult but not impossible — but because the gap between the principles he had publicly committed to and the conduct he chose to engage in was too consistent across his major decisions to be explained by anything other than the structure of his political character. He believed in his own brand more than he believed in the simple discipline of acting in accordance with it. And when the brand collided with the maneuver won. The maneuver always wins eventually when the brand is not actually anchored in the conduct it claims to represent. That November 2010 vote was the first warning sign, the moment when California established a principle that would only mean something if it held when holding it became expensive. It took the rest of the country a while to catch up, but the reckoning, in the form of this week's developments, has arrived, and it was, as it turns out, inevitable. You cannot build a political brand on a reform tradition and then override the reform when it becomes inconvenient and hope that the brand survives the override. Someone always notices. And the bill, the full accounting of what the governor did with the principle he had inherited, what his maneuver has cost the state's reform brand, and what the broader consequences are for independent redistricting across the country, is now coming due. History will not remember this governor the way his supporters hoped. It will remember him the way the evidence demands.